Between 1847 and 1874, 97 people vanished from a remote settlement deep in the West Virginia mountains. Not all at once, but in a pattern so precise it defied explanation. The disappearances occurred exactly every 3 months, always on the night of the new moon, always leaving behind a single leather shoe filled with mountain clay and pine needles. The shoe was invariably the left one, placed with ritualistic precision in the exact center of the missing person's bed. The clay still worn to the touch as if freshly excavated from deep underground. When federal investigators finally reached the isolated community of Hollow Ridge in the winter of 1874, they found 312 residents living in apparent prosperity. Their ledgers showing impossible wealth for such a remote location, their children dressed in Boston finery, their tables laden with imported delicacies, and not a single person willing to explain where the missing had gone. The investigators noted in their reports that every resident they questioned responded with the exact same phrase, spoken in an identical cadence: "The mountain keeps its own accounts." Oh, what they discovered in the abandoned copper mine beneath the settlement would be sealed in government records for over a century, requiring presidential authorization to access. And even today, the full report remains partially redacted. Before we continue with the story of Hollow Ridge, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments what state or city are you listening from. We love hearing from our community of dark history enthusiasts across the country. Your engagement helps us uncover more of these buried truths. The truth about Hollow Ridge begins not with the disappearances themselves, but with the desperate founding of a community that would do anything, absolutely anything, to survive the harsh realities of Appalachian isolation in the years before the Civil War. Hollow Ridge sat nestled in a valley so deep between the mountains that sunlight only reached it for 4 hours each day, even in the height of summer. The surrounding peaks rose like walls of stone and forest, their slopes so steep that clouds would catch on them and pour into the valley like milk into a bowl, leaving the settlement shrouded in mist for days at a time. Founded in 1845 by a group of 43 families fleeing the economic collapse that had devastated the coal regions of Pennsylvania, the settlement was meant to be a new beginning, a place where hard work and determination could still yield prosperity. These weren't criminals or outcasts. They were skilled miners, craftsmen, engineers, and their families. People who had built their lives on honest labor only to watch it crumble when the mines closed and the banks failed. The exodus was led by a charismatic former mine foreman named Josiah Henley, a man who'd spent 20 years underground and claimed he could smell copper in the rock from a mile away. Henley was 53 years old when he led the families into the mountains. But he moved with the energy of a man half his age. Those who knew him from the Pennsylvania mines spoke of his uncanny ability to find ore where others found only stone, of how he would press his ear to the rock face and claimed to hear the metal singing to him. His wife had died in the cholera outbreak of 1832, leaving him with 3 sons who had all followed him into mining, and it was partly for them and for the grandchildren beginning to arrive that he sought this new opportunity. The families who followed Henley into those mountains carried names that would later disappear from all official records, scrubbed from census data and land claims as if they had never existed. The Cranston from Philadelphia brought their knowledge of explosives. Patriarch William had helped blast the first railroad tunnels through the Alleghenies. The Dietrich family, recent German immigrants from the Rye Valley, understood the chemistry of ore processing. Friedrich Dietrich had studied at the University of Heidelberg before political upheaval forced his Immigration. The MacGreedy clan from Scotland, whose patriarch Thomas had engineered ventilation systems for the deepest mines in Europe, brought innovations that could make the difference between life and death underground. The Sutterfield family included Reverend Paul Sutterfield, a Methodist minister, who saw in this journey a chance to build a truly godly community, isolated from the corruption and vice of the cities. Each family brought specific skills, carefully selected by Henley during months of secret meetings in Pittsburgh boarding houses and church basement. He had approached them individually, speaking in hushed tones of surveys he'd conducted, of samples he'd tested, of a discovery that could make them all wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But more than wealth, he promised them independence, a chance to build a community answerable to no one but themselves, free from the coal companies and banks that had destroyed their previous lives. The location Henley chose was no accident. He had first heard of the valley from an old Cherokee guide named Joseph Stoncrow, whom he'd met in a Wheeling tavern in 1844. Stoncrow, deep in his cups, and speaking in a mixture of English and Cherokee, had told him of a valley his people avoided, where the water ran red after rain and where the earth itself seemed to breathe. Local Cherokee legends recorded by missionaries decades earlier spoke of the valley as a place where the earth itself was sick, where animals refused to den and where strange lights were sometimes seen moving beneath the ground on moonless nights. The Cherokee called it the place where the earth bleeds, and their oral history suggested that even the ancient peoples who preceded them had marked it as forbidden. But Henley saw opportunity where others saw warning. His preliminary surveys conducted with equipment he'd borrowed from his former employers indicated massive copper deposits of unprecedented purity. The geological formation suggested veins that went deeper than any mine in North America. Copper that had formed under conditions that shouldn't exist in the Appalachian range. He kept his findings secret, sharing them only with his most trusted associates, knowing that if word got out, larger interests would sweep in and claim everything. The journey to the valley took 3 weeks through terrain so rough that 2 wagons were lost to ravines and one family, the Penny Wells, turned back after their youngest child nearly drowned crossing a swollen stream. Those who persevered found themselves in a valley that seemed to exist in its own world, cut off from the rest of America by walls of stone and forests so thick that noon looked like twilight beneath the canopy. By the autumn of 1846, Hollow Ridge had grown to nearly 200 souls. The construction had been remarkable. In less than 18 months, they built a sawmill powered by Burden Creek, which ran red with mineral deposits every spring, staining the mill wheel, a permanent rust color that looked like dried blood in certain lights. They'd established a general store run by Marcus Finch, a former Philadelphia merchant, who kept meticulous records in ledgers that would later provide investigators with their most disturbing evidence. They built a one-room schoolhouse where Mrs. Eleanina Cranston taught 32 children using books donated by a mysterious benefactor in Baltimore who insisted on remaining anonymous. The Methodist Church, completed in the winter of 1846, stood at the center of the settlement. Its steeple, the only structure tall enough to catch the morning light before it reached the valley floor. Reverend Paul Sutterfield preached every Sunday about providence and perseverance, about how God had led them to this promised land, just as he had led the Israelites to Canaan. His sermons grew increasingly focused on sacrifice and covenant as the months passed, though few noticed the gradual shift in his theology at the time. The settlement even had its own postal route, though the mail carrier, a Cherokee Welsh mixed blood named Daniel Moss, only made the treacherous journey once a month. Moss would later testify that he always felt watched in Hollow Ridge, that the residents would gather in groups and whisper when he arrived, and that no one ever sent personal letters, only business correspondence related to their copper trade. But prosperity in Hollow Ridge came with peculiarities that visiting traders noticed immediately. The settlement produced refined copper ingots of remarkable purity, 99.9% pure, according to assayers in Baltimore. Yet no one ever saw the smelting operation. Work shifts began at midnight and ended before dawn, with miners entering and leaving through a concealed entrance that visitors were politely but firmly prevented from approaching. The miners themselves never spoke of their work, changing the subject if questioned, and their families seem to have been instructed to maintain the same silence. The copper they produced had unusual properties that made it highly sought after. Telegraph companies paid premium prices for Hollow Ridge copper wire, claiming it conducted electricity with less resistance than any other source. Jewelers in Philadelphia and New York reported that items made from Hollow Ridge copper never tarnished, maintaining a peculiar warmth to the touch that customers found appealing. One scientist from Harvard, Dr. Edmund Whitlock, traveled to Hollow Ridge in 1847 to study the copper, but his notes from the visit were later found to be missing crucial pages, and he refused to discuss his findings, retiring from academia shortly after his return. The first disappearance occurred on March 15, 1847, exactly 18 months after the settlement's founding. The date would later prove significant. It was not only the night of a new moon, but also the spring equinox, when day and night stood in perfect balance. Margaret Dietrich, age 19, vanished from her family's cabin sometime between sunset and sunrise. She was engaged to marry William Cranston's eldest son, Robert, and the wedding had been planned for May. Her parents, Friedrich and Anna, woke to find her bed empty, though the sheets remained perfectly arranged, as if she had never slept in them. The window stood open despite the freezing temperature. Ice had formed on the inside of the glass, and centered precisely on her pillow was a single leather shoe. Her left one, placed with deliberate care and filled with damp clay and pine needles that smelled of deep earth and something else, something metallic and organic that no one could quite identify. The shoe itself was disturbing in its condition. While it was certainly Margaret's, her initials were told into the leather. It showed signs of wear that didn't match its age. The sole was worn through in places as if she had walked hundreds of miles. Yet she had owned the shoes for only 2 months. The leather was stained with mineral deposits that had crystallized in patterns resembling veins or root systems. When Anna Dietrich tried to empty the clay from the shoe, she found it had hardened into a perfect mold of her daughter's foot, accurate down to the smallest detail. The community searched for 3 days with a thoroughness that reflected both their desperation and their growing fear. They divided the forest into a grid with each family responsible for a section. They combed every inch within 5 miles, checked every mine shaft and cave, dragged Burden Creek from its source to where it joined the larger Shadow River. Henley himself led search parties up treacherous mountain paths where snow still lay 3 feet deep, places where a single misstep meant certain death. They brought dogs from a neighboring settlement, but the animals refused to track, whining and cowering when presented with Margaret's scent. What they found disturbed them more than her absence. Near the old Cherokee marker stone, a granite boulder covered in symbols that predated even the Cherokee. According to Joseph Stonecrow, they discovered 17 dead ravens arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies still warm despite the freezing temperature. Each bird had died at exactly the same moment, their necks twisted at identical angles, their wings spread in identical positions. At the center of the circle, Pressed into the frozen earth was a handprint that matched Margaret's exactly, though it was pressed deeper into the ground than any human hand should have been able to achieve. Fresh axe marks on trees formed a path leading directly to the sealed entrance of what locals called the Old Working, a mine shaft that predated even the Cherokee. According to legend, the axe marks were at varying heights, starting at ground level and rising to nearly 20 feet up the trunk of an ancient oak, as if whoever made them had been ascending into the air as they walked. The marks themselves were peculiar, cut at angles that hurt to look at directly, forming patterns that seemed meaningful, but remained just beyond comprehension. The second disappearance came exactly 3 months later on June 15th, the summer solstice. This time it was William McCready, aged 34, a man strong enough to carry 200 pounds of ore on his back for miles without rest. He vanished from the mine's entrance station where he'd been keeping watch, a duty that rotated among the settlement's men. His replacement, Thomas Finch, found the guard post empty at midnight. A single shoe placed on the stool where William should have been sitting, filled with the same mixture of clay and pine needles, still warm to the touch. William's rifle remained propped against the wall, unfired, and his tobacco pipe sat on the small table, still smoking, as if he had just set it down moments before. The locked door to the mine entrance stood open, though the key remained in William's shoe along with the clay. Inside the entrance tunnel, investigators found footprints in the dust, but they started 30 feet inside the tunnel as if William had materialized there rather than walking in. The prints proceeded deeper into the mine for about 100 feet before stopping abruptly at a solid wall of rock, as if he had walked directly into the stone. By September, when 8-year-old Timothy Cranston became the third to vanish, panic gripped Hollow Ridge. The boy disappeared from a group of children playing in the afternoon sun. The other children reported that he had been there one moment and gone the next, like a candle being snuffed out. They found his shoe in the exact center of the church, though the building had been locked, and Reverend Sutterfield held the only key. The clay in this shoe contained something new. Tiny fragments of what appeared to be crystallized blood, though no one could explain how blood could crystallize in such a manner. Families barricaded doors with lumber torn from the mill. Men patrolled with rifles loaded with bullets they'd blessed in the church. Women clutched their children close, tying them to their wrists with rope when they had to leave the house. Some families attempted to leave, but found excuses to stay. Sick children, broken wagon wheels, sudden storms that made travel impossible. It was as if the valley itself conspired to keep them there. It was then that Henley called a town meeting that would change everything. The entire population gathered in the church on a night when the fog was so thick that people could barely see 3 feet ahead. They came in groups holding hands to avoid getting lost, their lanterns creating ghostly halos in the mist. Standing before every remaining soul in Hollow Ridge, Henley spoke words that multiple witnesses would later recount. With chilling consistency, each remembering not just what he said, but the exact cadence of his voice, as if the words had been burned into their memories. We came here seeking fortune, and fortune demands sacrifice. The mountain gives us copper, copper gives us wealth, and wealth demands payment. We all understood this when we signed the compact. We all agreed to the terms. The lottery is fair. The selection is random. And the obligation is absolute. We are not the first to make this bargain. And we will not be the last. The mountain has been feeding for longer than human memory. And it will continue to feed long after we are gone. But now, for our time, we are its servants, and it is our provider. That's when Martha Sutterfield, the Reverend's wife, stood and asked the question that would haunt survivor testimony for decades. "What did you find in the old working Josiah? What did you wake up?" Henley's response was to produce a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, written in a language that predated any known indigenous script. But somehow, impossibly, everyone in the church could read it, the meaning flowing directly into their minds without translation. The journal told of a previous mining operation, centuries old, maybe millennia, that had discovered the same copper deposits and made the same bargain. It contained detailed instructions for the ritual of selection, the schedule of sacrifice, and most disturbingly a ledger showing that exactly 2,347 people had fed the mountain before this. Previous civilization had disappeared, leaving only the sealed mine and the warning stones the Cherokee had wisely chosen to respect. The history of the old working stretched back further than any written record into the realm of geological time, where human history became indistinguishable from myth. Cherokee oral tradition meticulously documented by ethnographer James Mooney in 1891 spoke of a hole in the earth that existed before memory. Before the migration of peoples, perhaps before humanity itself crawled out of its caves. The Cherokee never mined there, never hunted within 5 miles of it, and their medicine men performed annual ceremonies to keep it sealed. Ceremonies that required the sacrifice of precious trade goods and sometimes took weeks to complete. They called it the breathing place, where the earth exhaled its poisons and inhaled its sustenance. Their stories told of a time before time, when beings that were not quite human and not quite spirit had delved deep into the earth, seeking something that was never meant to be found. These beings had built structures underground that defied understanding. Chambers where up became down. Tunnels that folded back on themselves yet still led somewhere new. Spaces that were larger inside than the mountain that contained them could possibly accommodate. According to the Cherokee stories, these ancient miners had eventually disappeared, but not through death or departure. They had become part of what they mined, their flesh transforming into metal, their bones into ore, their blood into the red water that seeped from the mountain every spring. The Cherokee believed that on certain nights you could still hear them working in the depths, the ring of their picks against stone carrying up through miles of rock, though the sound came from directions that didn't exist in the normal world. Spanish explorers in 1561, according to fragmentary records discovered in the archives of the Indies in Seville, reported finding evidence of extensive pre-Columbian mining operations in the central Appalachians. Hernando Dotos. Lieutenant Rodrigo de Guzman wrote in his journal of discovering perfectly round vertical shafts descending beyond the reach of their longest ropes, nearly 500 feet, with walls so smooth they seemed melted rather than carved. The shafts were precisely 3 feet in diameter, too narrow for a man to work comfortably. Yet they showed clear evidence of excavation. Guzman's most disturbing discovery was a chamber accessed through one of these shafts, where he found what he described as statues of such lifelike quality that we initially took them for corpses. These figures were made entirely of copper, but with a level of detail that exceeded any known metallurgical technique of the period. They depicted humans in positions of agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which. Their faces turned skyward, their hands raised as if in supplication or surrender. When one of Guzman's men struck one of these figures with a hammer, attempting to break off a piece as evidence, the entire statue crumbled to dust, and the man fell ill immediately, dying within hours while sweating a fluid that smelled of copper. The indigenous guides refused to approach closer than 100 red yards to these sites, claiming the holes belonged to the Star Walkers, beings who came before and would come after, who had descended from the sky to harvest the blood of the earth. They said these beings had not died, but had chosen to merge with what they sought, becoming eternal guardians of treasures that should never see daylight. One guide, an elderly man named Speaks with Thunder, told Guzman that his grandfather's grandfather had seen lights moving underground near these shafts. Lights that moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, but followed no human logic. When Henley's expedition first arrived in 1845, they found these ancient workings partially collapsed, but still accessible. The main shaft descended 400 feet through solid rock before opening into a natural cavern system of staggering complexity. The initial descent was treacherous. The original ladder system had long since rotted away, leaving only the iron brackets embedded in the stone, many of which had been transformed into copper through some unknown process. Henley and his men had to install new ropes and wooden platforms, working by lamplight in a shaft so perfectly vertical that drop tools would fall for nearly 30 seconds before the sound of impact echoed back up. But it was what they found in the deepest accessible chamber that changed everything. The walls were covered in a crystalline copper formation unlike anything in geological textbooks. Copper so pure it could be peeled off in sheets like paper. The metal grew in patterns that resembled organic structures, branching like blood vessels, spreading like neural networks, forming nodules that pulsed with a light that wasn't quite phosphorescence and wasn't quite reflection. When Henley first placed his hand on one of these formations, he reported feeling a shock that wasn't electrical, but something else. Something that traveled not through his nerves but through his bones, carrying with it images of places that couldn't exist and times that hadn't happened yet. Friedrich Dietrich, who had studied chemistry in Heidelberg before immigrating, conducted secret tests on the copper in a makeshift laboratory he built in his cabin cellar. His notes discovered, hidden in his cabin wall decades later, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, described properties that defied known science. The metal maintained a constant temperature of exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of ambient conditions. Even when placed in ice or held over flame, it remained at human body temperature. When melted and recast, it produced ingots of impossible density. A cubic inch weighed 3 times what it should have according to copper's known properties. And strangest of all, when placed in water, the copper caused the liquid to move in patterns that resembled breathing or circulation. The water would pulse rhythmically 20 times per minute, creating tiny whirlpools that spun in alternating directions. If multiple pieces of the copper were placed in the same container, they would synchronize their effects. The water moving in complex patterns that suggested communication between the metal fragments. Dietrich wrote that watching these patterns for too long induced severe headaches and nightmares of being underground, unable to breathe yet unable to die. The settlement's prosperity was undeniable and immediate. By 1850, Hollow Ridge was producing more refined copper than any 3 mines in the territory combined. The families lived in houses that would have been considered mansions in Charleston or Richmond. Their children wore clothes from Boston and New York, ate oranges from Florida in winter, and studied from books imported from London and Paris. The settlement had luxuries that major cities lacked. Running water in every home, heated by copper pipes that maintained their mysterious warmth. Gas lamps that burned with a peculiar blue-green flame that never seemed to consume their fuel. Yet no outsider ever saw a single miner emerge from the earth, covered in the dust and grime of honest labor. The men who worked the night shift appeared at dawn clean and dry, their clothes unmarked by the usual stains of underground work. When questioned, they would simply say the mine was well ventilated or remarkably clean, but their eyes would drift away, focusing on something in the distance that only they could see. Federal Surveyor Cornelius Vance arrived in Hollow Ridge in September 1851, tasked with mapping mineral claims for the newly formed state of West Virginia. His official report filed with the Department of the Interior described a thriving community with inexplicable characteristics that defied conventional understanding of mining settlements. But his private journal, discovered in his granddaughter's attic in 1923 and authenticated by handwriting experts, told a story that transformed the government's understanding of what had transpired in Hollow Ridge. Vance wrote of being housed with the Cranston family, where he noticed that meals were set for family members who never appeared. Each evening, Mrs. Cranston would lay out 7 place settings, though only 4 family members ever sat at the table. When he asked about the empty chairs, Mrs. Cranston would simply say, "They're working below," her voice carrying a strange resonance as if she were reciting a memorized phrase. The empty plates would be cleared at the end of each meal, and Vance noticed they showed signs of use, crumbs, stains, worn edges, despite no one having touched them during dinner. On his 3rd night in Hollow Ridge, unable to sleep due to a persistent humming that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, Vance followed a group of men who left the settlement at midnight. He tracked them through the forest, noting that they walked in perfect formation despite the absolute darkness. No lanterns, no torches, moving through the trees as if following a path visible only to them. They led him to a clearing, where the entrance to the old working lay concealed beneath a wooden structure disguised as an equipment shed. He watched 30 men descend into the earth in complete silence, their movements synchronized like dancers following unheard music. Each man carried nothing but a small leather pouch hung around his neck. And as they descended, Vance heard them humming, not with their voices, but somehow with their entire bodies. A vibration that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. He tried to count them as they entered, but the number kept changing in his mind. Sometimes 30, sometimes 300, sometimes 3. Vance waited until dawn, hidden in the underbrush, fighting off waves of nausea and vertigo that grew stronger the longer he remained near the mine entrance. Only 28 men emerged as the first light touched the mountains. They walked out in the same synchronized fashion, but now their pouches bulged with weight, and their skin had taken on a subtle sheen, as if they had been coated in the finest copper dust. The 2 missing men were never mentioned, never mourned, never even acknowledged as having existed. When he carefully asked Henley about the mine's operation the next day, the foreman's response chilled him to his core. Henley smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "The mountain takes its share, Mr. Vance. 2 from 30 is a reasonable tax. Your government takes far more and gives far less in return. Would you like to see our operation? We could use a man of your qualifications." The surveyor left Hollow Ridge that afternoon, claiming urgent business elsewhere. His official report stated only that the settlement's mineral claims appeared legitimate and that the copper production was substantial and of high quality. But in his journal, he wrote, "There is something unnatural in that place, something that wears the face of prosperity but stinks of decay. The copper they produce is real enough. I've tested it myself, but the cost of its extraction is measured in more than dollars. I fear that what they have awakened in those depths will not be satisfied with the sacrifice of a few. It will grow hungry. It will demand more. And God help us all when it can no longer be fed." The disappearances continued with mechanical precision that suggested not randomness but careful planning. Every 3 months on the night of the new moon, someone vanished. Always. At night, always leaving behind that single shoe filled with clay and pine needles. The clay always warm, always containing new elements, fragments of minerals unknown to science, crystallized organic matter that resembled neither plant nor animal tissue, sometimes tiny spheres of metal that moved on their own when observed, rolling always toward the mine. The victims varied, young and old, male and female, newcomer and founding family member. But investigation of settlement records revealed a horrible truth that the federal investigators would later try to rationalize as coincidence. The disappearances followed a pattern. They were selecting exactly one person from each family in rotation, maintaining a grotesque fairness that ensured every household shared the burden equally. No family lost 2 members until every family had lost one. The selection seemed random within each family, but the broader pattern was undeniable. Thomas McGreedy, who lost his son William in the second disappearance, began keeping detailed records in a journal he hid in a hollow tree a mile from the settlement. His writing, cramped and increasingly frantic as the years passed, documented not just the vanishings, but the wealth that followed each one. Within days of a disappearance, the mine's copper output would surge by exactly 33%. New veins would be discovered in previously barren rock. The quality of ore would improve dramatically, requiring less processing to achieve that impossible purity. McGreedy also documented changes in the settlement itself. The people were transforming slowly but unmistakably. Their skin developed a subtle copper tint that was most visible in sunlight. Their eyes began to reflect light in the dark like a cat's, but with a greenish hue. Children born in Hollow Ridge after 1850 never cried. Not as infants. Not when injured, never. They would simply stare, with those reflective eyes waiting patiently for their needs to be met. By 1858, McGreedy's journal entries had become increasingly disturbed. He wrote of dreams shared by the entire settlement. Dreams of moving through stone as if it were water, of breathing metal instead of air, of a vast intelligence that existed in the spaces between atoms, in the crystalline structure of copper itself. He wrote of waking to find his wife standing at the window speaking in a language that hurt to hear, conversing with something in the mind that answered in harmonic vibrations that made the whole house resonate. By 1865, with the Civil War ending and federal authority reasserting itself across the reconstructing nation, Hollow Ridge could no longer remain isolated. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad planned a spur line through the valley to facilitate copper transport. Government agents inventoried resources for the reconstruction effort, and investigative journalist Samuel Hartley from the Baltimore Sun arrived, drawn by rumors of a settlement where people vanished like smoke, but copper flowed like water, where children were born without crying, and where the night shift miners worked in perfect darkness, yet never had accidents. Hartley spent 3 months in Hollow Ridge, posing as a traveling merchant, interested in establishing regular trade. His editor had given him carte blanche to investigate what he called the most persistent and troubling rumors to come out of the Appalachian since the war began. What Hartley discovered exceeded his darkest suspicions and would eventually lead to his commitment to the Shepard Pratt Asylum in Baltimore, where he would spend his final years drawing obsessive diagrams of impossible underground geometries. The settlement operated on 2 distinct levels. The surface life of a prosperous mining town complete with socials, church services, and schoolhouse recitations, and a hidden structure of ritual and sacrifice that had evolved into something resembling a religion, though it worshipped no God that any Christian would recognize. The transformation had been gradual, so slow that the residents themselves seemed unaware of how far they had drifted from normal human behavior and belief. Hartley attended what residents called gratitude gatherings held in the church on the night before each new moon. The ceremonies began as seemingly normal prayer meetings with Reverend Sutterfield reading from the Bible and leading hymns. But as midnight approached, the service would shift. The language would change, starting with familiar Latin phrases, but evolving into something older. Words that predated any known human tongue. The congregation would respond in unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to achieve, creating sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the ground beneath their feet, from the air they breathed. Sutterfield, once a conventional Methodist minister who had preached about salvation and grace, now spoke of the covenant of the depths, the blessed transaction, and the willing gift. He had modified the Bible on his pulpit, inserting new pages that appeared to be made of beaten copper, so thin you could almost see through it, covered in text that shifted and changed depending on the angle of viewing. He preached that God had many faces, many names, and that the one they served in Hollow Ridge was older than the Christian God, older than any God worshipped by man, as old as the metal in the earth itself. The congregation had developed their own catechism, which Hartley transcribed phonetically, as the words themselves seemed to resist being written in English letters. What do we owe? They would chant, everything we are and will be. To whom do we owe it? To that which dwells in the deepness. How do we pay? With willing flesh and grateful souls. When will the debt be paid? When the last star burns cold and the earth gives up its final secret. On the night of December 15, 1865, Hartley witnessed a selection ceremony that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Every resident gathered in the church, including infants carried by their mothers and elderly citizens who had to be helped to walk. The fog that night was so thick it seemed solid, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. The church was lit by candles made from a substance that wasn't quite wax. They burned with that blue-green flame that characterized all fire in Hollow Ridge, and they gave off a smell that Hartley described as copper and corruption, metal and meat. A copper vessel was produced, ancient beyond description, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to move and writhe when observed peripherally. The vessel was passed hand to hand through the congregation. Each person dropped in a small personal item, a button, a coin, a thimble, a child's tooth, a lock of hair. The objects made no sound as they fell into the vessel, as if dropping into a space much larger than the container itself. Then Henley, now 60 years old, but seemingly untouched by age, his hair still black, his hands still steady, his eyes burning with that green reflection, reached into the vessel. His arm went in up to the shoulder, though the vessel itself was no more than a foot deep. He searched for what felt like hours, though the clock showed only minutes passing. Finally, he withdrew a single object, a brass button from the coat of Jacob Forrester, a recent widower who'd arrived only 6 months earlier, fleeing debts and sorrow in Ohio. Forrester stood without protest, though tears ran down his cheeks. His neighbors embraced him, weeping and whispering things in his ears that Hartley couldn't hear, but that made Forrester nod and smile through his tears. His children, twin boys of 14, were taken to stay with the Dietrich family, who promised to raise them as their own. There was a ritual to it all, movements and words that had been refined through repetition. 27 years of practice making the horrible efficient That night, Forrester walked alone to the old working. Hartley followed at a distance, watching the man move through the fog with the certainty of someone who could see his path clearly. At the mine entrance, Forrester removed his clothes, folding them neatly and placing them on a bench that had been built for this purpose. He put on a robe made of a material that looked like cloth, but moved like liquid, clinging to his skin in ways that defied physics. Then he descended into the shaft. Hartley waited until dawn, hidden in the same spot where Vance had watched 14 years earlier. But Forrester never emerged. As the sun rose, Hartley crept to the mine entrance and found Forrester's left shoe placed precisely on the bench where his clothes had been. The clothes themselves were gone. The shoe was filled with the familiar clay and pine needles, but also with something else. A photograph of Forrester's late wife, though it had been transformed, the paper now made of thin, beaten copper. Her image still visible but changed. Her eyes now seeming to follow the viewer with an awareness that no photograph should possess. But Hartley discovered something else that night, something that would make his expose impossible to publish without being dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Hidden in the records of the settlement's founding, in a strong box buried beneath the church's cornerstone, he found the original compact, the agreement signed by every founding family. The document was written on what appeared to be human skin, though it had been treated with copper salts that had turned it green and given it a metallic sheen. It wasn't just a mining charter or land claim. It was a contract written in English, but referencing concepts and entities that belonged to no earthly jurisdiction. The compact spoke of those who dwell beneath, of the hunger of the deep, and of the price of extraction. It laid out the terms in horrifying clarity. In exchange for unlimited wealth from the earth, the community would provide willing vessels on a schedule determined by lunar cycles. The selection would be random but fair. The chosen would go willingly, or the entire community would suffer consequences described only as the rising and the consumption. The contract was signed not just with names but with blood. Each signature was brown with age, but still seemed wet to the touch, still smelled of iron and copper. Most disturbing of all was an addendum added in Henley's hand and dated 1847. Having discovered the true nature of the bargain and finding no escape from its terms, we hereby accept our role as shepherds of the feeding. We understand that our prosperity is built on consumption, that our wealth flows from sacrifice, and that our children and our children's children shall inherit both the blessing and the curse. We pray that God, if He still watches this forsaken place, will forgive us for what we have become and what we must continue to be. Hartley also found records of attempts to break the compact. In 1853, a family named the Washburns had tried to flee in the night. They were found the next morning in their wagon at the settlement's edge, their bodies transformed into copper statues, perfect in every detail down to the expressions of terror on their faces. The statues were melted down and the copper distributed among the remaining families who wore jewelry made from it, as a reminder of the price of betrayal. In 1859, a group of younger residents, led by Robert Cranston, the same man who had been engaged to Margaret Dietrich when she became the first to disappear, attempted to seal the mine with explosives. The detonation had no effect on the entrance, but Robert and his conspirators aged 50 years in a single night. Their hair white, their skin wrinkled, their bones brittle. They lived only a few more days, spending them warning others that the mine was not just a hole in the ground, but a mouth, and that it had teeth that extended throughout the entire valley. Everything changed on the night of March 15, 1874, exactly 27 years after the first disappearance. The number 27 held significance that Hartley had discovered in his research. It was 3 by 3 by 3, a number that appeared repeatedly in the pre-Columbian symbols found in the mine, a number that the Cherokee considered cursed, a number that represented completion in the arcane mathematics that governed the compact. The settlement had known this night was coming, had been preparing for it with increasing anxiety as the date approached. The selection ceremony chose Mary Henley, Josiah's own granddaughter, a girl of 16 who was engaged to marry the school teacher's son, a young man named Edwin Garrett, who had been born in Hollow Ridge and had never known life outside the valley. Mary was beloved in the community. She taught the youngest children their letters, helped care for the elderly, and had a voice that could make even the strange hymns they now sang sound beautiful. For the first time in 27 years, someone refused to go. Mary barricaded herself in her family's home, using furniture to block the doors and windows. She had prepared for this possibility, having suspected she might be chosen. The pattern had become predictable to those who paid attention, and her family's turn had come round again. She had written letters hidden throughout the house, explaining her refusal. In them, she wrote, "I have seen what happens to those who go below. They do not die. Death would be merciful. They become part of something that should not exist. Their consciousness trapped in metal. Their souls dissolved in copper. Aware for eternity of what they have become. I will not go. Let the compact be broken. Let us face whatever consequences come. Better to die as humans than live as whatever we are becoming." The entire settlement gathered outside the Henley house. They pleaded with her for hours, their voices growing increasingly desperate. As midnight approached, parents held their children up to the windows, begging her to think of them. The elderly reminded her of all the prosperity the compact had brought, the lives it had enabled, the community it had built. Her own grandfather, Josiah, knelt in the mud that had formed from a sudden unseasonable rain, pressing his hands against the door and speaking to her in that old language that predated words. As the new moon rose invisible in the dark sky, the earth began to respond to the broken contract. The ground beneath Hollow Ridge started to vibrate, not like an earthquake, but like breathing, like a gigantic chest expanding and contracting. The rhythm matched no human heartbeat. It was too slow, too deep, each breath taking minutes to complete. With each exhalation, a warm wind rose from cracks that appeared in the earth, carrying with it the smell of copper and something organic. Something alive, but not in any way that biology could explain. The water in Burden Creek reversed its flow, running uphill toward the old working, and as it flowed backward, it turned red. Not the rusty red of mineral deposits, but the bright crimson of fresh blood. Fish in the creek were swimming backward, too, moving against their own will, their eyes reflecting that green light that had infected everything in Hollow Ridge. Birds fell from the sky, not dead, but transformed. Their feathers turned to copper wire so fine it looked like hair. Their bodies still moving, still trying to fly with wings that could no longer generate lift. And from the mineshaft came a sound that survivors would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. Not quite screaming, not quite singing, but something that contained elements of both. It was the sound of the 93 people who had been taken over the years, their voices somehow still present, still conscious, calling out from wherever they were, whatever they had become. Some witnesses claimed they could identify individual voices. Margaret Dietrich singing the lullaby she had hummed while sewing. William McCready calling for his father. little Timothy Cranston reciting his arithmetic tables in an endless loop. Henley made a desperate decision. He understood perhaps better than anyone what lay beneath Hollow Ridge, what they had awakened and fed for 27 years. He knew that if the compact was broken, if the feeding stopped, what dwelt below would rise to take what it was owed. And it would not stop with Hollow Ridge. The hunger that had been contained, directed, controlled for nearly 3 decades, would spread. The copper veins that ran beneath the mountains, connected to deposits throughout the Appalachian, throughout the continent, perhaps throughout the world. If the thing below was released from its bargain, its hunger would follow those veins like an infection through a bloodstream. Accompanied by the 3 other founding members still alive. Friedrich Dietrich, now 73, but still strong from years of handling copper that had changed his very bones. Thomas McCready, who had documented everything and understood the patterns better than anyone, and Reverend Sutterfield, who had transformed their faith to accommodate their damnation. Henley descended into the old working one final time. They carried with them items that had been prepared for this possibility. Ropes made from human hair collected from 27 years of haircuts, carefully braided and treated with copper salts. Lanterns that burned that blue-green flame, but could somehow illuminate spaces that normal light couldn't reach. And most importantly, the original copper vessel that had been used for every selection, now filled with the personal effects of all 93 who had disappeared. Items that had been carefully preserved for reasons that were about to become clear. What happened in the depth that night was witnessed only by Samuel Hartley, who had hidden himself in the mine's upper galleries days before, surviving on rainwater and heart attack. Determined to see the truth of Hollow Ridge, no matter the cost to his sanity. His account, written in a shaking hand on pages torn from his notebook, some of them stained with what appeared to be copper-tinted tears, described scenes that challenged the boundaries of the possible, while remaining entirely within the realm of the physical. The 4 old men descended past the copper formations that everyone knew about, past the worked galleries, where miners extracted their wealth, into chambers that had never been mapped because they couldn't be mapped. There, geometry changed depending on who observed them and when. They descended for what felt like hours, but what Hartley's pocket watch insisted was only minutes. Time itself becoming unreliable. In the deep places of the earth, they reached a chamber that Hartley struggled to describe. Not because it was indescribable, but because describing it accurately would require admitting that everything humans understood about space and dimension was incomplete. The chamber was simultaneously vast and intimate. Its walls miles away yet close enough to touch. It was lit by the phosphorescent minerals that had been mentioned in old reports. But the light they gave off didn't behave like light should. It cast shadows that fell upward. It illuminated things that weren't there while leaving visible objects in darkness. And there, in the center of this impossible space, they found the source of Hollow Ridge prosperity and curse. It wasn't a monster or demon, but something worse. Evidence of a previous human civilization that had discovered the same copper deposit centuries or millennia before. The walls were covered with the mummified remains of hundreds of bodies, perfectly preserved by the unique mineral composition of the cave. They were arranged in precise patterns, each one positioned at the terminus of a copper vein, their bodies penetrated by metal that had grown through them like roots through soil. But they weren't dead. Not in any conventional sense. The copper's unique properties, its constant human body temperature, its breathing patterns in water, all made horrible sense. The metal was somehow sustaining them in a state between life and death, using their biological processes to catalyze its own growth. They were conscious, aware, trapped in bodies that had become geological features. Their nervous systems transformed into copper wire that transmitted not electrical signals, but something else. Something that predated human understanding of consciousness. The 93 people who had disappeared from Hollow Ridge were here too, integrated into the system, their bodies in various stages of transformation. Margaret Dietrich was recognizable, though copper had replaced her hair and grown through her skin in patterns that resembled the grain in wood. Her eyes were still aware, still capable of focusing on the men who had entered the chamber. When Henley approached her, she moved. Not much. Just a slight turn of her head, but enough to show that she recognized him, remembered him, perhaps even forgave him. And at the center of it all was something that had no name because it predated naming. It wasn't an entity, but a process, a function of the universe that humans had never been meant to discover. The copper wasn't just a metal. It was a medium, a substance that could preserve and transmit consciousness across geological time. The civilization that had first discovered this had tried to achieve immortality through it, had fed themselves to it willingly, believing they were transcending death. Instead, they had discovered something worse than death. Eternal awareness without agency, consciousness without control, existence without end. The federal investigators arrived 3 days later, summoned by telegraph messages that spoke of earthquakes and disasters. Though no seismic activity had been recorded by any instruments outside the valley, they found Hollow Ridge in chaos that defied their attempts at rational explanation. The mine had collapsed, but not in any way that geology could explain. The rock had flowed like water and then hardened in patterns that looked organic, like the mountain itself had squeezed the tunnel shut the way a throat swallows. The old working was sealed beneath thousands of tons of stone that had materialized from nowhere. Rock that didn't match any geological survey of the area. Josiah Henley and his 3 companions were missing, presumed dead in the collapse, though their bodies were never found. Mary Henley was alive, but changed. Her hair had turned white overnight. Her eyes had lost their green reflection and turned gray as mountain stone, and she spoke only in whispers that hurt to hear. She would tell the investigators nothing useful, responding to all questions with the same phrase. They chose to hold the door closed. Pray it stays that way. Most disturbing of all were the 93 members of the settlement who were found wandering the forest in various states of confusion and madness. They had no explanation for how they came to be there. The last thing each remembered was going to sleep in their homes in places scattered across the country. Some of them years or decades ago. They were people who had been reported missing from towns throughout the Appalachian. People who had vanished without trace or explanation. People whose families had given them up for dead. Medical examination revealed they all showed signs of prolonged exposure to extreme mineral concentrations. Their hair had turned white. Their skin bore strange scarring patterns that resembled copper veins running beneath the surface, and they spoke in whispers of dreams about being buried alive, while somehow remaining conscious, aware of every grain of soil, every drop of water that passed through the earth around them. Several had to be restrained when they tried to return to the collapsed mine, insisting they had left something important below, though none could say what. The government's official report classified until 1974 under the National Security Act concluded that Hollow Ridge had been the site of illegal mining operations using dangerous practices. That led to widespread mercury and copper poisoning, causing hallucinations and mental instability among the population. The settlement was evacuated, the land condemned, and the Entire valley declared off-limits to development under the pretense of geological instability. The report made no mention of the 93 people who had apparently returned from the dead, officially listing them as displaced persons who had been found during the evacuation. But Samuel Hartley's hidden journal, discovered in the wall of his cell at the Shepherd Pratt Asylum after his death in 1876, told a different story. Before his final descent into madness, he wrote of how the four old men had made a final bargain in the depths. They had offered themselves as permanent guardians. Their bodies to be integrated into the system not as fuel but as regulators, their conscious will focused on a single purpose: to keep what dwelt below from rising, to maintain the seal between the deep places and the surface world. The collapse, Hartley claimed, wasn't an accident or a natural consequence of the broken compact. It was Henley using the last of the mining explosives, charges, that had been placed throughout the mine over the years for this exact purpose, to seal the old working forever. But it wasn't just a physical seal. The four men had positioned themselves at key points in the underground chamber, allowing the copper to grow through them while they still lived, while their wills were still their own. They had become living locks, their consciousness the only thing keeping the door closed. The 93 survivors were relocated across the country by the federal government. Their families scattered to prevent them from gathering again. Most died within 5 years, their bodies unable to adapt to life away from the mineral-saturated environment of Hollow Ridge. But before they died, many reported the same recurring dream. They were standing in a vast underground chamber, watching 4 old men slowly turning to copper, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal determination, their bodies spreading like roots through the rock, holding closed a door that must never be opened. Mary Henley, whose refusal had broken the compact and precipitated the final crisis, disappeared from federal custody during the relocation. She was never found, though reports from the 1880s describe a woman matching her description living among the Cherokee in North Carolina, teaching their children about the dangers of disturbing the deep places of the earth, and the importance of keeping certain doors forever sealed. She was said to carry with her a copper vessel, ancient and covered in symbols that hurt to look at, which she claimed contained the contracts and promises of those who had learned too late that some knowledge comes with a price that can never be fully paid. The land where Hollow Ridge once stood is now part of a federal wilderness area, closed to all public access under severe penalty. The official reason is geological instability and contamination from historical mining operations. Satellite images show that nothing grows in a perfect circle with a 5 m radius around the former settlement. The earth there is neither dead nor alive, but something in between waiting. Water samples from the area still show impossible copper concentrations. Copper that maintains that constant temperature of 98.6 degrees. Copper that causes water to move in breathing patterns. Every 3 months on the night of the new moon, seismic equipment stationed around the perimeter registers rhythmic vibrations from deep underground. Vibrations that match the pattern of human breathing, though much slower, as if what breathes below has learned patience in its imprisonment. The vibrations are strongest on March 15th, June 15th, September 15th, and December 15th, the dates when the sacrifices were made, as if something below still expects to be fed on schedule. In the decades that followed the sealing of Hollow Ridge, there were several attempts to investigate the site, all ending in failure or tragedy. A team of geologists from the Smithsonian Institution arrived in 1889. Equipped with the latest drilling equipment of their era, they managed to bore 30 feet into the collapsed mine entrance before their drill bits struck something that shouldn't have existed. A vein of copper that was liquid at room temperature that flowed upward against gravity. when they withdrew the drill. The substance that came with it defied classification. It appeared to be copper mixed with organic material, as if metal and flesh had somehow fused at a molecular level. The team sealed their borehole with molten lead, a material mentioned in Henley's notes as being antithetical to the copper's growth, and left within hours. Their official report stated only that the site was geologically unstable and unsuitable for further investigation. Local hunters in the 1880s and 1890s reported finding leather shoes in the forest surrounding the forbidden zone. Always the left one, always filled with clay and pine needles that remained warm to the touch regardless of weather. By the turn of the century, exactly 97 such shoes had been documented, one for each person who vanished during Hollow Ridge's 27 years of operation. The shoes were always discovered on the nights of the new moon, placed with deliberate care on tree stumps or rocks containing not just clay but sometimes other items. A photograph, a button, a child's tooth. Objects that had belonged to the disappeared, yet somehow remained untouched by time. The few guards assigned to patrol the perimeter in those early years had their own superstitions. They claimed that on certain nights, always the new moon, always at the quarterly dates when the sacrifices had occurred, they could hear something calling from underground. Not voices exactly, but vibrations that formed words in their minds. 97 distinct tones speaking as one, promising wealth beyond imagination to anyone brave enough to unseal the mine. Tools left near the border would be found the next morning, moved closer to the center as if drawn by magnetic attraction. Compasses became useless within a mile of the site, their needles spinning wildly before pointing not north but straight down into the earth. Perhaps most significant was a letter discovered in the private papers of President Grant after his death in 1885, dated 1874. The situation in West Virginia has been contained, but at terrible cost. We must ensure that no one ever attempts to reopen that mine. The four who sacrificed themselves to seal it understood what I cannot put in official records: that some hungers once awakened can never be fully satisfied, only temporarily contained. Their vigil must not be disturbed. Zoti. The letter was accompanied by a map showing copper deposits throughout North America, with Hollow Ridge at the center of a vast network of veins that stretch from Alaska to Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Certain locations on the map were marked with red X's and dates. Other sites where similar discoveries might have been made and quickly sealed, where other communities might have made other bargains, where other doors might be waiting for someone foolish enough to open them. In the final entry of Samuel Hartley's journal, dated just days before his death in 1876, he wrote with surprising clarity, "I have seen the truth of Hollow Ridge, and it has broken something fundamental in my understanding of the world. We tell ourselves that the earth is rock and soil, dead material from which we extract dead wealth. But the earth is alive in ways we cannot comprehend. And in some places it is hungry. The 97 souls who fed that hunger are neither dead nor alive, but something between. Something that should not be. And the four who chose to become eternal guardians to transform themselves into living seals. They are the only thing standing between that hunger and the world above. God help us if their vigil ever fails." Mary Henley was never officially found after her disappearance from federal custody, but stories persisted throughout the 1880s of a woman matching her description traveling through Appalachian communities, warning them about the dangers of deep mining, teaching them to recognize the signs of copper that grew too pure, that maintained impossible warmth, that caused water to breathe. She was said to carry an ancient copper vessel, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to move when observed directly, which she claimed contained the last testament of those who had learned too late that some bargains could never be broken, only transferred to the next generation of the desperate and ambitious. The last official document regarding Hollow Ridge was filed in 1891 by the newly formed U.S. Geological Survey. It designated the entire valley as a permanent exclusion zone with access forbidden under federal law. The report noted that the area exhibited anomalous geological properties inconsistent with regional norms and recommended that no future mining or development be permitted within a 10 miles radius. The specifics of these anomalies were sealed, requiring congressional approval to access approval that has never been granted. Local folklore in the surrounding counties speaks of Hollow Ridge as a cursed place, though the stories have been deliberately confused and contradicted over the years, perhaps to prevent anyone from understanding the full truth. Some say it was a plague that killed the settlement. Others claim it was a mine collapse. Still others whisper about deals made with things that live in the deep places of the earth. All agree on one thing: the mountain remembers what happened there, and it waits with infinite patience for someone to forget why the seals were put in place. The copper mining industry in West Virginia continued to grow through the end of the 19th century, but certain unwritten rules emerged among the mining companies. Never dig below a certain depth. Never pursue veins that maintain human body temperature. Never work mines where the water flows uphill or where copper grows back after being harvested. These rules were never officially acknowledged, but were passed down from foreman to foreman, from company to company, a secret knowledge that some things were more valuable left in the ground. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that the government truly sealed away all evidence of what happened at Hollow Ridge? Or could there be more sites like this hidden in America's forgotten corners? Places where desperate people made impossible bargains for prosperity. Leave your comment below and tell us your theory about what really happened to those 97 souls. Are they truly gone, or are they still down there conscious in there copper prisons waiting for someone to break the seal that Josiah Henley and his companions died to maintain? If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's hidden history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves unsolved mysteries. And remember, some doors are sealed for a reason. Some hunger should never be fed, and some bargains once made can never be fully broken. The mountain remembers, and it is patient. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another terrifying chapter from America's past that they don't teach in history books. Another settlement that vanished from maps. Another community that discovered that the earth holds secrets that were never meant for human eyes.